I had just moved into my first apartment, a cozy one-bedroom on the edge of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, and the building was filled with older residents, making it feel safe and welcoming. At first, everything seemed perfect. My apartment was on the ground floor, with large windows that let in plenty of light. The only downside was that the windows faced the street, meaning I had to keep the curtains closed most of the time for privacy. After settling in, I started noticing that one of my neighbors, an older man named Mr. Harris, would often be outside, tending to his garden. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was just a friendly, retired man with a green thumb. However, as the weeks passed, I began to notice that Mr. Harris was outside almost every time I left my apartment or returned home. Whether it was early in the morning or late at night, he always seemed to be there, watching. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but his presence started to feel more and more unsettling. One evening, as I was getting ready to go out, I caught a glimpse of him through the curtains. He was standing on the sidewalk, staring directly at my window, his eyes fixed on the spot where I stood. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly closed the curtain, trying to shake off the creepy feeling that settled over me. The next day, I decided to confront him, hoping to clear the air and ease my mind. I waited until I saw him outside, then casually walked over and struck up a conversation. Mr. Harris was polite, but there was something off about the way he looked at me. His eyes were cold and calculating. When I asked him if he was okay, he just smiled and said he was fine, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to keep the conversation short and excuse myself as soon as I could. As I walked back to my apartment, I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows, but it did little to ease my anxiety. As I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the window. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was coming from the living room, where the window faced the street. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw Mr. Harris standing just outside, his face inches from the glass. He was grinning, his eyes wide with a look of twisted pleasure. I screamed and stumbled backward, quickly pulling the curtain shut and grabbing my phone to call the police. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, Mr. Harris was gone. They searched the area and took my statement, but there was little they could do without any solid evidence. The officers advised me to stay somewhere else for the night, but I refused to let him chase me out of my own home. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, barely able to sleep, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked about the possibility of moving to a different apartment in the building, but there were no vacancies. I felt trapped, with no other option but to stay and face whatever was to come. Over the next few days, I noticed that Mr. Harris was no longer outside as often. I hoped that the police visit had scared him off, but I couldn't let my guard down. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like something was being scratched against the wall. I grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, I found nothing but an empty room, but then I noticed it. The window was slightly open, just enough for someone to reach in. I rushed to close it and locked it securely, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Mr. Harris was still out there, and he was getting bolder. The final straw came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the living room. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the sound of the front door opening. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as I hid under the covers. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was knew exactly where I was. The operator on the other end of the line kept telling me to stay calm and that help was on the way, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, and I could hear the sound of someone breathing on the other side. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the footsteps retreated. I heard the front door slam shut, and I knew that Mr. Harris had fled. The police arrived moments later, and they searched the building, but Mr. Harris was nowhere to be found. They told me that they would keep an eye on the building, but I knew that wasn't enough. I couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, I packed up my belongings and moved in with a friend until I could find a new place. I never saw Mr. Harris again, but I'll never forget the terror of those nights, knowing that someone was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Even now, years later, I still feel uneasy when I think about that time. I've moved far away from that apartment, but the fear of being watched has never fully left me. I'm always cautious about who I interact with, always aware of my surroundings. Mr. Harris may be gone, but the memory of his twisted grin still haunts me. I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted in my own home, and I'll never take my safety for granted again. It started innocently enough. I met Greg at work, and we quickly became friends. He was easygoing and always up for grabbing a drink after work. At first, it was nice to have someone to hang out with, especially since I was new to the city and didn't know many people. Greg seemed like a genuinely good guy, always interested in what I was doing and how my day went. But after a few weeks, I started noticing some things that made me uncomfortable. Greg would text me constantly, even late at night, asking where I was and what I was doing. If I didn't respond right away, he would send more texts, each one more insistent than the last. It started to feel less like friendship and more like he was keeping tabs on me. One night, after ignoring a few of Greg's texts because I was out with some other friends, I came home to find him waiting outside my apartment. He looked agitated, his eyes darting around, as if he expected someone to jump out at him. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" he asked, his voice tense. I was taken aback. He had never shown up at my place unannounced before. I tried to brush it off, telling him I was busy, but the whole situation left me feeling uneasy. Greg apologized and said he was just worried about me, but his explanation didn't sit right. Something about the way he was acting made me feel like this wasn't just concern. It was something more. Over the next few weeks, Greg's behavior became more erratic. He would show up at my apartment at odd hours, sometimes even in the middle of the night, saying he just wanted to check on me. At work, he started getting involved in my projects without being asked, hovering over me and making suggestions that I didn't need. My coworkers began to notice, asking if everything was okay between us. I assured them it was. But inside, I was growing more and more uncomfortable. It felt like Greg was everywhere I went, always watching, always waiting for a chance to insert himself into my life. One weekend, I decided to take a break from the city and visit my family out of town. I didn't tell Greg I was leaving, hoping to get some distance from him, but when I arrived at my parents' house, there he was, waiting in his car down the street. My heart dropped into my stomach. How had he found out where I was going? I confronted him, demanding to know what he was doing there. Greg's expression was blank, as if he didn't see anything wrong with following me. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe," he said, but his words only made me feel more trapped. After that, I knew I had to distance myself from Greg. I stopped responding to his texts and avoided him at work as much as possible. But the more I pulled away, the more persistent he became. He started leaving notes on my car, on my desk at work, even on the door of my apartment. They were always friendly on the surface, but there was an underlying tone that made my skin crawl. It was as if he was trying to remind me that he was always there, always watching, no matter where I went. One night, I came home to find that my apartment had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been moved slightly, just enough to let me know that someone had been there. My heart raced as I called the police, but there were no signs of forced entry, and nothing to link the break-in to Greg. Still, I knew it was him. I could feel it. The police took my report, but couldn't do much without evidence. They suggested I change my locks and be more cautious, but that did little to calm my nerves. The next day at work, Greg acted as if nothing had happened. He was as friendly as ever, but there was something in his eyes that unnerved me. I couldn't prove that he had broken into my apartment, but the way he looked at me made it clear that he knew what I suspected. I decided then and there that I needed to get away from him, to put as much distance between us as possible. I started looking for a new job, one that would take me out of the city and away from Greg for good. The final straw came when Greg showed up at my parents' house again, this time with flowers. He acted like it was a normal visit, like he was just dropping by to say hello. My parents were confused but polite, not understanding the depth of the situation. I pulled Greg aside and told him he needed to leave and never contact me again. His face twisted in anger, and for the first time, I saw the real Greg, the one who had been hiding behind the mask of a friend. "You can't get rid of me that easily," he hissed before storming off. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, knowing that he wasn't going to let me go without a fight. That night, I packed my bags and left the city for good. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and started a new life far away from Greg. For a while, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to show up out of nowhere. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to relax, believing that I had finally escaped him. Just when I thought I was safe, I received a package at my new address. There was no return address, but I knew who it was from as soon as I opened it. Inside was a single photo of me, taken from a distance, walking down the street in my new neighborhood. The message was clear. Greg had found me again. I felt the walls closing in around me, the fear that I thought I had left behind, coming back with full force. I knew I couldn't keep running forever, but I also knew I couldn't let Greg win. I reported the incident to the police, but without any proof of who sent the package, there was little they could do. To this day, I live with the fear that Greg is still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I've taken every precaution I can, but the sense of security I once had is gone. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of him, but I refused to let him control my life. I've learned to be cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never let my guard down. Greg may still be out there, but I'm determined to live my life without fear, no matter how many times he tries to come back into it. It all began one late summer evening when I received a phone call from an unknown number. At first, I thought nothing of it. Telemarketers or wrong numbers were pretty common. But when I answered, there was no response on the other end, just silence. I said hello a few times, but still nothing. Eventually, I hung up, thinking it was a glitch or someone playing a prank. But then, the calls started coming more frequently, always from a different unknown number, and always with the same unnerving silence on the other end. The silence of the calls became more unsettling as the days went on. It wasn't just the lack of a voice on the other end, it was the sense that someone was there, listening, but refusing to speak. The calls would come at all hours of the day and night, sometimes only a few minutes apart. I tried blocking the numbers, but they kept changing, making it impossible to stop them. After a week of this, I started to feel anxious every time my phone rang, dreading the sound of that unnerving silence. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, the phone rang again. This time, instead of hanging up, I decided to stay on the line, waiting to see if the caller would eventually say something. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible breath on the other end. It sent chills down my spine, and I quickly hung up, my heart racing. This was no prank. Whoever was calling me was deliberately trying to unsettle me, and it was working. I reported the calls to the phone company and the police, but there was little they could do. The numbers were untraceable, and without any direct threats, the police couldn't take much action. They advised me to change my number, but I hesitated, worried that it wouldn't stop the caller. Despite my growing fear, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the constant calls were wearing me down. I started to feel like I was being watched, like the caller knew everything about me and was waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, the calls took a terrifying turn. I was alone in my apartment, watching TV, when my phone rang again. This time, instead of silence, I heard a low, raspy voice whispering my name. I froze, my blood running cold as the voice repeated my name over and over again. It was the most chilling sound I had ever heard, filled with a sinister intent that made my skin crawl. I hung up, but the phone rang again almost immediately. I didn't answer it this time, but the ringing continued, relentless, until I finally turned off my phone. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I started noticing things out of place in my apartment. Small things, like the position of a chair or an open window that I was sure I had closed. It was as if someone had been there, moving things around, just enough to let me know they had been inside. My paranoia grew, and I began to feel like I was being hunted. I decided to take the police's advice and change my number, hoping it would put an end to the calls. For a few days, it worked. My phone was blissfully silent, and I started to relax, thinking that the ordeal was finally over. But then, late one night, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. My heart sank as I answered the call, and the familiar silence greeted me on the other end. I hung up immediately, but the phone rang again and again, and again. The caller had found me, and they weren't going to stop. Desperate, I decided to stay with a friend for a while, hoping that being in a different location would make me feel safer. But even there, the calls continued. My friend answered the phone once, only to hear the same unnerving silence that I had become so familiar with. We both knew then that this wasn't going to end easily. The caller was fixated on me, and they weren't going to let go until they had what they wanted, whatever that was. One night, while staying at my friend's place, we heard a knock at the door. It was late, and neither of us was expecting anyone. My friend looked through the peephole and saw nothing, but the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. We didn't dare open the door, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. The knocking eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. We both knew that the caller was there, just outside, waiting. The next morning, we found a note slipped under the door. It was a single piece of paper with my name written on it, in the same low, raspy handwriting as the voice on the phone. My friend called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. The police increased their patrols in the area, but they couldn't offer much more than that. I was at my wits' end, terrified that the caller was going to escalate their behavior even further. Eventually, I decided that the only way to escape was to leave the city altogether. I packed my things and moved to a new place, far away, hoping that distance would finally sever the connection between me and the caller. For a while, it worked. The calls stopped, and I started to feel safe again. But deep down, I knew that the fear would never fully go away. Every time my phone rings, I feel a twinge of anxiety, worried that the silence on the other end is waiting to return. I've learned to live with it, but I'll never forget the terror of being stalked by someone who knew my every move, someone who was always watching, always waiting.